Well, this is about state budgets. This is probably the most boring topic of the whole morning. But I want to tell you, I think it's an important topic that we need to care about. State budgets are big, big money. I'll show you the numbers. And they get very little scrutiny. The understanding is very low. Many of the people involved have special interests or short-term interests that get them not thinking about what the implications of the trends are. And these budgets are the key for our future. They're the key for our kids. Most education funding, whether it's K through 12 or the great universities or community colleges, most of the money for those things is coming out of these state budgets. But we have a problem. Here's the overall picture. US economy, it's big, 14.7 trillion. Now out of that pie, the government spends 36%. So this is combining the federal level, which is the largest, the state level and the local level. And it's really in this combined way that you get an overall sense of what's going on, because there's a lot of complex things like Medicaid and research money that flow across those boundaries. But we're spending 36%. Well, what are we taking in? Simple business question. The answer is 26%. Now this leaves 10% deficit. Sort of a mind-blowing number. And some of that, in fact, is due to the fact we've had an economic recession. Receipts go down, some spending programs go up. But most of it is not because of that. Most of it is because of ways that the liabilities are building up and the trends, and that creates a huge challenge. In fact, this is the forecast picture. There's various things in here I could say, you know, we might raise more revenue, or medical innovation will make the spending even higher. It is an increasingly difficult picture, even assuming the economy does quite well, probably better than it will do. This is what you see at this overall level. Now how did we get here? I mean, how could you have a problem like this? I mean, after all, at least on paper, there's this notion that these state budgets are balanced. Only one state says they don't have to balance the budget. But what this means actually is that there's a pretense. There's no real true balancing going on. And in a sense, the games they play to hide that actually obscure the topic so much that people don't see things that are actually pretty straightforward challenges. When Jerry Brown was elected, this was the challenge that was put to him. That is, through various gimmicks and things, a so-called balanced budget had led him to have $25 billion missing out of the $76 billion in proposed spending. Now he's put together some thoughts about half of that he'll cut, another half perhaps in a very complex set of steps taxes will be approved. But even so, as you go out into those future years, various pension costs, health costs go up enough, and the revenue does not go up enough, so you get a big squeeze. What were those things that allowed us to hide this? Well, some really nice little tricks. And these were somewhat noticed. The paper said it's not really balanced, it's got holes, it perpetuates deficit spending, it's riddled with gimmicks. And really, when you get down to it, the guys at Enron never would have done this. I mean, this is so blatant, so extreme. You know, is anyone paying attention to some of the things these guys do? They borrow money. They're not supposed to, but they figure out a way. They make you pay more in withholding just to help their cash flow out. They sell off the assets. They defer the payments. They sell off the revenues from tobacco. And California is not unique. In fact, there's about 5 states that are worse, and only really 4 states that don't face this big challenge. So it's systemic across the entire country. It really comes from the fact that certain long-term obligations, healthcare where innovation makes it more expensive, early retirement and pension where the age structure gets worse for you, and just generosity that these misaccounting things allowed to develop over time, that you've got a problem. This is the retiree health care benefits, $3 million set aside, $62 billion liability, much worse than the car companies. And everybody looked at that and knew that that was headed towards a huge problem. The forecast for the medical piece alone is to go from 26% of the budget to 42%. Well, what's going to give? Well, in order to accommodate that, you would have to cut education spending in half. It really is this young versus the old to some degree. If you don't change that revenue picture, if you don't solve what you're doing in healthcare, you're going to be de-investing in the young. The great University of California university system, the great things that have gone on won't happen. So far, it's meant layoffs, increased class sizes. Within the education community, there's this discussion of, should it just be the young teachers who get laid off or the less good teachers who get laid off? And there's a discussion, if you're going to increase class sizes, where do you do that? How much effect does that have? And unfortunately, as you get into that, people get confused and think, well, maybe you think that's okay. In fact, no, education spending should not be cut. There's ways, if it's temporary, to minimize the impact, but it's a problem. It's also really a problem for where we need to go. Technology has a role to play. Well, we need money to experiment with that, to get those tools in there. There's the idea of paying teachers for effectiveness, measuring them, giving them feedback, taking videos in the classroom. That's something I think is very, very important. Well, you have to allocate dollars for that system and for that incentive pay. In a situation where you have growth, you put the new money into this. Or even if you're flat, you might shift money into it. But with the type of cuts we're talking about, it will be far, far harder to get these incentives for excellence or to move over to use technology in the new way. So what's going on? Where's the brain trust that's in error here? Well, there really is no brain trust. It's sort of the voters, it's sort of us showing up. You know, just look at this spending. California will spend over $100 billion. Microsoft, 38, Google, about 19. The amount of IQ and good numeric analysis, both inside Google and Microsoft and outside with analysts and people with various opinions, should they have spent on that? No, they wasted their money on this. What about this thing? It really is quite phenomenal. You know, everybody has an opinion, that there's great feedback, and the numbers are used to make decisions. If you go over to the education spending, the healthcare spending, particularly these long-term trends, you don't have that type of involvement on a number that's more important in terms of equity, in terms of learning. So what do we need to do? We need better tools. We can get some things out on the internet. I'm going to use my website to put up some things that'll give the basic picture. We need lots more. There's a few good books, one about school spending and where the money comes from, how that's changed over time and the challenge. We need better accounting. We need to take the fact that the current employees, the future liabilities they create, that should come out of the current budget. We need to understand why they've done the pension accounting the way they have. It should be more like private accounting. It's the gold standard. And finally, we need to really reward politicians. Whenever they say there's these long-term problems, we can't say, oh, you're the messenger with bad news? We just shot you. In fact, there are some, like these, Erskine Bowles, Alan Simpson, and others, who've gone through and given proposals for this overall federal health spending state-level problem. But in fact, their work sort of pushed off. In fact, the week afterwards, some tax cuts were done that made the situation even worse than their assumptions. So we need these pieces. Now, I think this is a solvable problem. You know, it's a great country with lots of people, but we have to draw those people in because this is about education. And just look at what the tuitions happened with the University of California and project that out for another 3, 4, 5 years. It's unaffordable. And that's the kind of thing, the investment in the young, that makes us great, allows us to contribute, it allows us to do the art, the biotechnology, the software, and all those magic things. And so the bottom line is we need to care about state budgets because they're critical for our kids and our future. Thank you.
So in my free time outside of Twitter, I experiment a little bit with telling stories online, experimenting with what we can do with new digital tools. And in my job at Twitter, I actually spend a little bit of time working with authors and storytellers as well, helping to expand out the bounds of what people are experimenting with. And I want to talk through some examples today of things that people have done that I think are really fascinating, using flexible identity and anonymity on the web, and blurring the lines between fact and fiction. But I want to start and go back to the 1930s, long before a little thing called Twitter. Radio brought us broadcast and connected millions of people to single points of broadcast. And from those single points emanated stories. Some of them were familiar stories, some of them were new stories, and for a while they were familiar formats. But then radio began to evolve its own unique formats specific to that medium. Think about episodes that happened live on radio. Combining the live play and the serialization of written fiction, you get this new format. And the reason why I bring up radio is that I think radio is a great example of how a new medium defines new formats, which then define new stories. And of course, today we have an entirely new medium to play with, which is this online world. This is the map of verified users on Twitter and the connections between them. There are thousands upon thousands of them. Every single one of these points is its own broadcaster. We've gone to this world of many to many, where access to the tools is the only barrier to broadcasting. And I think that we should start to see wildly new formats emerge as people learn how to tell stories in this new medium. I actually believe that we are in a wide open frontier for creative experimentation, if you will, that we've explored and begun to settle this wild land of the internet and are now just getting ready to start to build structures on it. And those structures are the new formats of storytelling that the internet will allow us to create. I believe this starts with an evolution of existing methods. The short story, for example, people are saying that the short story is experiencing a renaissance of sorts, thanks to e-readers, digital marketplaces. One writer, Hugh Howey, experimented with short stories on Amazon by releasing one very short story called Wool. And he actually says that he didn't intend for Wool to become a series, but that the audience loved the first story so much they demanded more. And so he gave them more. He gave them Wool 2, which was a little bit longer than the first one, Wool 3, which was even longer, culminating in Wool 5, which was a 60,000-word novel. I think Howie was able to do all of this because he had the quick feedback system of ebooks. He was able to write and publish in relatively short order. There was no mediator between him and the audience. It was just him directly connected with his audience and building on the feedback and enthusiasm that they were giving him. So this whole project was an experiment. It started with the one short story, and I think the experimentation actually became a part of Howie's format. And that's something that this medium enabled, was experimentation being a part of the format itself. This is a short story by the author Jennifer Egan called Black Box. It was originally written specifically with Twitter in mind. Egan convinced the New Yorker to start a New Yorker fiction account from which they could tweet all of these lines that she created. Now, Twitter, of course, has a 140-character limit. Egan mocked that up just writing manually in this storyboard sketchbook, used the physical space constraints of those storyboard squares to write each individual tweet. And those tweets ended up becoming over 600 of them that were serialized by the New Yorker. Every night at 8 p.m., you could tune in to a short story from the New Yorker's fiction account. I think that's pretty exciting. Tune in literary fiction. So this whole project, the experience of Egan's story, of course, like anything on Twitter, there were multiple ways to experience it. You could scroll back through it. But interestingly, if you were watching it live, there was this suspense that built because the actual tweets, you had no control over when you would read them. They were coming at a pretty regular clip. But as the story was building, normally as a reader, you control how fast you move through a text. But in this case, the New Yorker did. And they were sending you bit by bit by bit. You had the suspense of waiting for the next line. Another great example of fiction and the short story on Twitter, Elliot Holt is an author who wrote a story called Evidence. Began with this tweet: on November 28th at 10:13 p.m., a woman identified as Miranda Brown, 44, of Brooklyn, fell to her death from the roof of a Manhattan hotel. Begins in Elliot's voice, but then Elliot's voice recedes, and we hear the voices of Elsa, Margot, and Simon, characters that Elliot created on Twitter specifically to tell this story, a story from multiple perspectives leading up to this moment at 10:13 p.m. when this woman falls to her death. These three characters brought an authentic vision from multiple perspectives. One reviewer called Elliot's story, quote, Twitter fiction done right, because she captured that voice and she had multiple characters and it happened in real time. Interestingly, though, it wasn't just Twitter as a distribution mechanism, it was also Twitter as a production mechanism. Elliot told me later she wrote the whole thing with her thumbs. She laid on the couch and just went back and forth between different characters, tweeting out each line by line. I think that this kind of spontaneous creation of what was coming out of the characters' voices really lent an authenticity to the characters themselves, but also to this format that she had created of multiple perspectives in a single story on Twitter. As you begin to play with flexible identity online, it gets even more interesting as you start to interact with the real world. Things like Invisible Obama or the famous binders full of women that came up during the 2012 election cycle, or even the fan fiction universe of West Wing Twitter, in which you have all of these accounts for every single one of the characters in the West Wing, including the bird that taps at Josh Lyman's window in one single episode. All of these are rapid iterations on a theme. They're creative people experimenting with the bounds of what is possible in this medium. You look at something like West Wing Twitter, in which you have these fictional characters that engage with the real world. They comment on politics. They cry out against the evils of Congress. Keep in mind, they're all Democrats. And they engage with the real world. They respond to it. So once you take
As you begin to play with flexible identity
online, it gets
engagement
with the real world, and you move beyond simple homage or parody, and you put these tools to work in telling a story. That's when things get really interesting. So during the Chicago mayoral election, there was a parody account. It was Mayor Emanuel. It gave you everything you wanted from Rahm Emanuel, particularly in the expletive department. This foul-mouthed account followed the daily activities of the race, providing commentary as it went. It followed all of the natural tropes of a good, solid Twitter parody account, but then started to get weird. And as it progressed, it moved from this commentary to a multi-week, real-time science fiction epic, in which your protagonist, Rahm Emanuel, engages in multi-dimensional travel on election day, which is it didn't actually happen. I double-checked the newspapers, and then very interestingly, it came to an end. This is something that doesn't usually happen with a Twitter parody account. It ended, a true narrative conclusion. And so the author, Dan Sinker, who was a journalist, who was completely anonymous this whole time, I think, Dan, it made a lot of sense for him to turn this into a book because it was a narrative format in the end. And I think that turning it into a book is representative of this idea that he had created something new that needed to be translated into previous formats. One of my favorite examples of something that's happening on Twitter right now, actually, is the very absurdist Crimer Show. Crimer Show tells this story of a super criminal and a hapless detective that face off in this exceptionally strange lingo with all of the tropes of a television show. Crimer Show's creator has said that it is a parody of a popular type of show in the UK, but man, is it weird. And there are all these times where Crimer, the super criminal, does all of these TV things. He's always taking off his sunglasses or turning to the camera. But these things just happen in text. I think borrowing all of these tropes from television and additionally, presenting each crimer show as an episode, spelled E-P-P-A-S-O-D, episode, presenting them as episodes, really, it creates something new. There is a new episode of crimer show on Twitter pretty much every day, and they're archived that way. And I think this is an interesting experiment in format. Something totally new has been created here out of parodying something on television. I think in nonfiction real-time storytelling, there are a lot of really excellent examples as well. Real-Time World War II is an account that documents what was happening on this day 60 years ago in exceptional detail, as if you were reading the news reports from that day. And the author Teju Cole has done a lot of experimentation with putting a literary twist on events of the news. In this particular case, he's talking about drone strikes. I think that in both of these examples, you're beginning to see ways in which people are telling stories with nonfiction content that can be built into new types of fictional storytelling. So with real-time storytelling, blurring the lines between fact and fiction, the real world and the digital world, flexible identity, and anonymity, these are all tools that we have accessible to us, and I think that they're just the building blocks. They are the bits that we use to create the structures, the frames, that then become our settlements on this wide open frontier for creative experimentation. Thank you.